Afternoon. This is a regular meeting of the Metropolitan Council, June 28th, 2023, and welcome everyone to a very important day. I just want to, first I actually want to acknowledge that this is among a very important day because we're having a little ceremony here, but I also want to acknowledge that it's a holiday, Eid. Eid. I stand corrected. But anyway, Yassine, thank you for being with us today. I just acknowledge that that's something we generally try not to have at formal meetings, but I appreciate that you could join us. And we were almost all here for the swearing-in ceremony because we've all been reappointed by the Governor Walz and the Lieutenant Governor Flanagan administration to serve in this second term. And because of the redistricting that happens every 10 years, Councilmember Vento is wondering how often we're going to be doing this. 10 years, we'll see you again, where we have new districts, and so the same group of council members are appointed to sometimes dramatically, other times less dramatically revised districts. So, and I really appreciate everyone who's here because we've done important work. And I think this is officially the day we say we no longer have new and experienced. We'll stop using those words. We are now all experienced. And by the virtue of the fact that everybody is here means you are willing to accept this new reappointment. So with that, with the governors, on behalf of the governor, thank you for serving the state of Minnesota, for our region. And we'll have an opportunity for a swearing-in ceremony. So this is very difficult work. We're going to have to move to the center of the horseshoe here, and I'll stand in front of you. And we did this once before, so I think we'll all get it done well. We'll have the actual oath of office. So for that, let's move into that position.
Have to read.
Mine got, I'm hoping they'll use some sort of a lens. We are not. Oh, yeah.
Maybe the next meeting we'll have to.
People kind of face this direction, please, towards me. Everybody kind of come in a little bit closer, yeah. Sharon, maybe you push this line out just a little bit.
Very handsome. All right, I will ask you to please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I do hereby swear.
I do hereby swear
To support the constitutions of the United States and the state of Minnesota.
to support the constitutions of the United States and the state of Minnesota,
And to faithfully discharge my duties as a Metropolitan Council member.
and to faithfully discharge my duties as a Metropolitan Council member
To the best of my judgment and ability.
to the best of my judgment and ability.
Congratulations, you have been sworn in as a council member of the Metropolitan.
We're just going to do a quick
I got
shot,
sworn
please,
in.
with the chair over in the front, right here. Y'all just kind of swing around, one of the flags in the background.
This way, we're going to take some pictures with the flags in the backdrop. Actually, Reba facing the other.
Jerry, you can jump in there too if you want. I can grab that for you. That'd be Okay, everyone can look to me, big smile. And just get a couple, that's great. Great, great, thank you all very much. Are you okay?
Yeah. Wait, one more time.
One more. Should we set one more, I'm sorry. Just one more, sorry.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Okay, thanks.
I can grab this whenever, but if you want to sign it.
Great, yeah. 20 lead up.
Where are we at? 28th?
What a, yeah. Thank you.
We were, and I didn't dress before. Oh, there we go. There we go.
It's not an action anyway, so we're good.
Can I swim?
Yeah, okay. All right, Sue has it. Okay, so then I don't need to worry. More years, maybe.
Been waiting for that day.
Again.
Congratulations, everyone, again, and thank you.
Since the governor's saying,
So now, on to our important work. First, the minutes that were, the agenda, which has been laid out before you, I assume it can be approved without disagreement, which brings us to the minutes from June 14th, 2023. Is there a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
Move approval.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All right, hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The minutes are approved. And this is the point of our meeting where we invite members of the public to come and address the council on matters not on the agenda for our 3-minute presentations. Has anybody signed up? No. Nobody has signed up, so I think that we will move on to our business, our first business item, which is the 2023 Unified Budget Amendment, second quarter, and I'm not sure if Stewart has a presentation. None needed. We have seen that in the past, so I'd entertain a motion and approval and a second.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I am pleased to report business item 2023-102, joint business item, the Unified Budget Amendment. The 2023 second budget amendment makes changes to the operating budget in regional administration, community development, MTS, and Metro Transit, and changes to the capital budget in community development, environmental services, MTS, and Metro Transit. The proposed amendment was reviewed and approved by the Community Development Committee on June 5th, the Transportation Committee on June 12th, Environmental Services Committee on June 13th, and the Management Committee on June 14th. So lots of eyeballs have been on this prior to tonight. In regional administration, the amendment adds 2 permanent FTEs, 1 in human resources and 1 in real estate. It also adds an additional $500,000 for services to support follow-up work in our transportation programs via contract, and an additional contract for $125,000 in communications for a cultural assessment of the entire Met Council. In Metro Transit, the amendment brings an additional $50 million in federal pandemic relief funds to the bus operations budget, accelerating the budgeted drawdown of federal funds. In MTS, the amendment moves $518,000 in MVEST funds from the contracted services operating budget to their capital budget, and $518,000 in federal funds from the contracted services capital budget to their operating budget. In community development, the amendment adds $6.7 million to the park's pass-through budget to recognize an increased fiscal year 2024 appropriation from this past legislative session. Turning to the capital budget, the amendment makes changes to 36 projects in Metro Transit. Most notably, it moves $100 million in federal pandemic relief funds from the capital improvement program into the authorized capital program for the Green Line Extension project. The amendment makes changes to 38 projects in community development budget, to 71 projects to the MTS capital budget and to 3 project and environmental services. These changes are detailed specifically in tables 9, 10, and 11. Therefore, Mr. Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council authorizes the 2023 unified budget as amended and in accordance with the attached tables.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Further comments? There will be a roll call vote, so with no discussion, I will call for a vote.
Johnson.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Carter.
Aye.
Barber. Aye. Cameron. Aye. Pacheco.
Aye.
Zilligren.
Aye.
Bozeman.
Aye.
Deli.
Aye.
Morales.
Aye.
Bento. Aye. Cedarburg.
Aye.
Aye.
Carter. Aye. Zolkar. Aye. Wolf.
Aye.
The motion carried. The unified budget amendment has been passed. On to the consent agenda business. Is there a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Thank you. Any second?
Second.
Any discussion? And all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The consent business agenda is approved. On to community development. Councilmember Lilligren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Community Development Committee brings one item for our consideration this evening. Council members, Mr. Chair, it's business item 2023-120. It's to award $1 million in Livable Communities Act pre-development grant funds to support 6 pre-development projects in 5 cities. These pre-development grants are for projects that are in the planning and design stage of a physical development or redevelopment, which has the potential to advance the Livable Communities Act and Thrive goals. Pre-development grants are intended for projects that need to complete additional work to fully shape and detail the final development, and typically they include a range of activities, including but not limited to feasibility analysis, various project studies, infrastructure, systems engineering, development and planning needs, design work, and community engagement. 13 applications were received from the cities of Brooklyn Center, Maplewood, Minneapolis, South St. Paul, St. Louis Park, and St. Paul. 6 of the applications submitted met the minimum scoring criteria and award limits to be eligible for funding. The projects awarded will support affordable housing, mixed-use development, and local small businesses and community organizations. So, Mr. Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council awards 6 Livable Communities Act pre-development grants totaling $1 million, as shown in Table 1 as part of the report, and authorize the Executive Director of Community Development to execute the grant agreements on behalf of the Council.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carried. Which brings us to the Environment Committee, and I believe Councilmember Wolf?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Business item 2023-128 requests that the Metropolitan Council ratify the emergency declaration for repairs to Interceptor 7017-2 along State Highway 7 in Excelsior in the amount not to exceed $300,000. On May 22nd, a wastewater leak was reported along the L20 force main in the city of Excelsior in the northeast boulevard of the intersection of Oak Street and State Highway 7. MCES operations were informed and immediately dispatched tanker trucks to lift station L20 to perform cleanup and deter wastewater flow from the lift station to stop the spill. The L20 force main 7017-2 is connected to the larger L19 dual force main system, which backfed wastewater at a higher rate to the leak. The pipe was, sorry, I'm tongue-tied today. The pipe was excavated, which revealed a hole in the side of the pipe, and a repair band was applied to the pipe as well. Flow was returned, and local and state agencies were notified of the condition. And this pipe is actually scheduled to be replaced next year, but it happened to break right before
It almost made it.
Yeah. But we appreciate staff's diligence in getting this repaired and cleaned up quickly. Therefore, Mr. Chair and members of the council, I move that the Metropolitan Council Regional Administrator ratify the emergency declaration for repairs to Interceptor 7017-2 along State Highway 7 in Excelsior in the amount not to exceed $300,000.
Thank you. Is there a second? Thank you, Councilmember Carter. Any discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That declaration of repair has passed. On to the Management Committee. There are no reports except on the consent agenda for the Management Committee. The Transportation Committee, Councilmember Barbeau.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, council members, business item number 2023-129 regarding the implementation of the Transit Fare Elimination Pilot Program. The 2023 Transportation Finance Bill requires the council to implement a transit fare elimination pilot program starting July 1st, 2023 for 18 months. Transit service under this program must be provided free of charge or at a reduced fare on 2 regular routes. Staff identified Route 32 and 62 that meet the requirements of House File 2887 and is the best alternative for this transit fare elimination pilot program. Both routes serve people who depend on transit, people of color, people with low incomes, serve the East Metro and West Metro communities, and are 2 routes that include a mix of core local and supporting local service. The legislation also requires the council to provide regular route transit service free of charge to individuals who are certified as disabled under the FTA's ADA requirements or certified by the council as eligible for Metro Mobility service. The free fare service for Metro Mobility riders applies to all regular routes system-wide, not just the 2 pilot program regular routes. Consistent with FTA regulations, Metro Mobility trips with origins and destinations within 3/4 of a mile of each side of the 2 selected regular routes will also be free for riders. Staff will submit a comprehensive report to the legislature by February 15th, 2025, detailing the results of the fare elimination pilot program. Transportation Committee members request to have access to the Title VI analysis for the fare change and ask for some clarification on the number of routes to be used in the pilot program. Ultimately, it did pass unanimously through the Transportation Committee. Therefore, Mr. Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council implement the legislatively mandated transit fare elimination pilot program on Metro Transit Route 32 and 62 from July 1st, 2023 to December 31st, 2024. From July 1st, 2023 to December 31st, 2024, provide all regular route service free of charge to individuals who are certified as disabled under the Americans with Disability Act requirements of the Federal Transit Administration or certified as eligible for special transportation service under Minnesota Statutes Section 473.386 Subdivision 2A. And also, and direct staff to submit the required legislative report on the pilot program by February 15th, 2025.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. And just a note that this was the subject of an information item in a previous meeting, and so we've had a thorough explanation. Any discussion? All right, hearing none. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That action is approved. On to our information item. Katie Roth, who his name is synonymous with ABRT at Metro Transit. And we are one of the leading areas in the country, and joined by Sophia Guinness. Good to see you both. And we look forward to this update as to kind of where we stand. And it is, as I understand, more than just 1 or 2. We're very busy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and council members. I'm delighted to be here today with a robust amount of time for a fairly robust presentation and hopefully robust discussion around our very robust arterial bus rapid transit plan that we are currently implementing. So I'm Katie Roth. I'm Director of Arterial BRT at Metro Transit. I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Sophia Guinness, Director of Community Affairs. I also use she, her pronouns.
All right. So with that, we will get underway. And I think I'll just use this Well, I might need some support in figuring out how to advance these slides tonight.
Oh, they just magically advanced.
Success.
Greg must be doing
All
it.
right, we're good. Thank you, Greg. All right, so the presentation that we have for you tonight is broken down into 4 parts. First, I want to speak to the program overview and how we develop these projects, because there's so much in common with how each project is advancing. I want to make sure that you've got a good understanding of how staff are implementing this vision. Next, I'll hand things off to Sophia for a very important part of the presentation focused on engagement throughout the process. I'll speak to the application and implementation of the Transitway advancement policy that should be, and then give you an overview of the 5 active projects in development right now, the B, E, F, G, and H lines. So this is a slide that may be familiar to you, showing the extent of the metro network we have in development right now. All told, we are planning for 12 BRT lines to be operational by 2030. That includes 2 highway BRT lines in operation, the red and orange line, 3 arterial BRT lines in operation, the A, C, and D lines, 2 guideway BRT lines in development right now, gold and purple, and then the 5 remaining lines, arterial BRT, planned to be operational by 2030, all in development. This slide talks about how these projects are different, how each of these types of BRT differs, but the main thing is that we are developing these so that they appear to our customers to have more alike than dissimilar, one unified metro system of fast, frequent, all-day service. Some of the things that do differ between how we advance arterial BRT projects from highway and guideway BRT have to do with how these projects are developed. For arterial BRT projects, the council is the body that oversees these projects from planning through operations, whereas on the highway and guideway BRT side, there's more often a transition between a county sponsor, a local sponsor, to the council. So we'll see that across the presentation and across the various stages of development. We also see that the funding sources vary on these projects. On arterial BRT, these projects are typically funded by a mix of state and federal funds. And more recently, we've begun to develop these projects as FTA small starts projects in the Capital Investment Grant Program. This is owing to them generally being of a smaller scale of investment than on the highway and guideway BRT side. And then, of course, they do differ in how they run. These are primarily in mixed traffic with some bus-only lanes and other transit advantages, generally running in robust transit markets that are already served by local bus service as opposed to more of a regional scale running in highway HOT or HOV lanes or in an exclusive BRT guideway. In terms of what we deploy with these projects, everything that we're thinking about building with these projects is designed to be faster, more reliable, and make the service easier to use for customers. It starts with the stations. We generally deploy 2 or 3 stations per mile, going from places that generally have stops every block to stations two or three times per mile, and designing those for faster stops. At the stations, we have a lot of technology to support the customer experience, to support safety and security, customer information, and make those places that are a good place, a comfortable place to wait for the bus. We employ pre-boarding fare payment, just like we do on light rail, for faster service and shorter stops. And then we allow people to get on and off through all doors of the vehicle, which really speeds up service as opposed to everybody lining up at that front door to pay a fare. We do run these lines in corridors with bus priority signals, so where the traffic signal responds to a sensor on the bus that emits a communication and provides more green time. And then we work closely with our city and county and DOT partners to implement bus lanes that can support faster service as well. And we tie this all together with faster and frequent all-day service. So this is both directions, all day, and importantly, this serves all kinds of trips. So we've seen that this has been a very durable source of ridership throughout the pandemic and as travel patterns have continued to change. So in terms of how these lines are prioritized for BRT improvements, I mentioned that Metro Transit and the council oversee these lines from start through operation. That goes back into how these lines have been identified. So the A through E lines were first identified as part of our initial arterial BRT study in 2012, and each of those lines has subsequently been added to the program really from that original planning basis. In 2019 through 2021, we undertook a planning effort called Network Next to identify the next lines in the system, rooting that in council policy, doing significant engagement as well as technical analysis, focused on these 4 factors: equity, ridership, network access, and making that a sustainable network for investment in the long term. That was the process that culminated in the F, G, and H lines being adopted by the council and subsequently amended into the Transportation Policy Plan, and also resulting in 7 additional candidates for 2040 to come from that plan but not be prioritized as the F, G, and H lines. We intend in 2025, every 5 years, to update that plan. We'll start from those 7 additional 2040 candidates, but also take a look at what else has changed in the region. And that'll be a process that will engage community and our local partners around, culminating in the recommendations that we would bring to the council for the next lines in the network. In terms of project funding, this slide shows the project cost estimates by corridor and the sources of funding that we've identified for each of those lines. So all told, these 8 lines, A through H, total approximately $572 million. And we have about $439 million of active development in the B through H lines right now. Aside from those first 2 corridors, which were shorter corridors, less complex, typical corridor projects now range in that roughly $60 to $120 million range, dependent on the scale, the project scope, the number of buses, et cetera. This translates to about $4 to $7 million per mile, again, depending on that project scope. The regional solicitation, shown in blue here, has historically played a very large role in providing early funding for these corridors. Starting with the F line, TAB instituted an arterial BRT category to set aside funding for an arterial BRT project to be named through a regional process. Previously, those projects competed against other transit priorities in the region in modernization and expansion categories, and were typically very high scoring. So this both allows for other projects to get funded and set aside a predictable expectation for an arterial BRT project. So the G line followed. We anticipate also advancing the H line as our arterial BRT priority for the upcoming regional solicitation. As you know, the state has also been a significant funder of ABRT, most recently with $72 million in bonding allocated in the most recent legislative session. With this, as you can see on the chart here, we show the G line as a fully funded project. And while we're still working through kind of where exactly all of the funding sources will align, we do anticipate saying that that G line is a fully funded project, and the H line is now our next funding pursuit in the ABRT program. I'll note that state funding is also key to the pursuit of that yellow bar on the F line, federal small starts funding for the F line. So that early investment, both from the regional solicitation and the state funding in that project, allowed for us to ultimately successfully bring the F line project into the capital investment grant pipeline and be included in President Biden's 2024 budget with a funding recommendation for more than $50 million for that project. So with that, we've had a lot of success in funding this program, and we'll continue to seek sources for the H line to bring that to a fully funded status as well. One other item I want to focus on here is that the project delivery structure and staffing is a little bit different from the projects in the LRT and the Guideway BRT program. Again, as I mentioned, the council is the governing body for arterial BRT from planning through operations. There's not a separate corridor management committee, and that's because we don't have a separate funding partner in this program. On the staffing side, arterial BRT is a department embedded inside of Metro Transit. We do not have a separate project office. And then within the arterial BRT department, we have a network and corridor planning team that focuses both on those efforts to identify future corridor priorities, as well as, once that corridor has been identified, focusing on the planning efforts around stations and other elements. When a project enters engineering, it transitions to one of 2 project delivery squads that alternates projects, hopping from the D line to the E line to the G line, and then from the B line to the F line to the H line. We rely heavily on consultant support for design and construction administration. That's one of the main contracting elements that we bring forward through the council. And we also have very key partnerships from assigned staff and other Metro Transit departments. Sitting next to me, of course, community outreach and engagement is embedded in our project teams, and also connected to the overall Metro Transit structure to really emphasize that importance of engagement in the projects. And we also work closely with our engineering and facilities team. Their construction services staff are assigned to deliver construction and work with our contractors throughout that phase. So now stepping into the process that we go through to develop a corridor. From the start of planning in a corridor, once that line has been identified, to the start of operations, what we've typically seen is that this is about a 5-year process. So starting out from the approved alignment, our planning team begins developing a corridor plan that sets the number of stations and where the stations are down to the intersection quadrant. This really consists of a lot of engagement, both internal with Metro Transit staff who know and understand these corridors, with our local partners, cities, counties, and MnDOT, and then very importantly, in community to identify priorities, use of the corridor, things that we need to understand about how those corridors work for people. When staff recommendations are assembled for that full corridor, we start a multiple phase of public review process that culminates in the final corridor plan being brought forward to the council for approval. Then that project transitions to engineering, which is typically about a 2-year process, resulting in construction documents that then we bring out to bid and then commence with what's typically been 2 years of construction on each project. In that second year of construction is when we begin that handshake with our operations folks who will run this service once that ribbon is cut, and transition into integrating that line, testing, training operators, all of the things that we need to make this service successful. I'll note at the bottom of this screen, we've got the public engagement and communications wrapped throughout the process as a through line. With the most significant opportunities for that input about where stations are going to be and feedback on our recommendations at the beginning of the process. Really that focus on robust, proactive, and responsive communication continues through design and into construction so that we're making sure community is continuously informed and engaged, even if there aren't decisions that are ripe for engagement at that time. You can see at the very bottom where each of the lines in development are right now. We're really marching forward with one line after the next. I'll just layer onto here as well the 2 key actions that council takes to shape the scope of these projects. The first is, as I mentioned, following that regional look at arterial BRT priorities, identifying the next lines. And really that's about what is the corridor, where does it run, what are the endpoints. Again, that last occurred in 2021 with the FG and H lines, and we anticipate that starting in 2025, we'd restart that process for the next priorities. And then, of course, the next piece is the council action to adopt the corridor plan, establishing those station locations, and very importantly, narrowing the scope of that project so that as we move through engineering and into construction, those station locations are identified and not subject to change as we continue to progress those projects. So in terms of other actions that the council takes, many of these look similar to the other transitway projects. As I mentioned, there are major engineering and construction administration contracts that we award. And the next one that will be coming up will be for the Metro F line. I'll note that I know there's been a lot of discussion among council members about DB Eagles, so I'll just add to this that typically for engineering and construction administration contracts, well, for each of these that results in a competitive procurement, we work with the Office of Equity and Equal Opportunity, and they will assign a goal. I'll note that on this type of work, construction administration and engineering, they've typically been in kind of the 15 to 17% range. That's what we've seen recently. We'll also go through a number of interagency agreements with our partners. Some of them might be joint powers agreements that convey the local power, say, to relocate utilities to the council so that we can do that work in right-of-way owned by others. We also have a number of cooperative construction agreements wherein we convey funding or funds are conveyed to the council for us or our partners to construct things cooperatively together in these corridors. One of the actions related to real estate deals with authorizing the council staff to acquire easements and condemn if necessary. I'll note that most easements on these projects tend to be temporary and very small. We're talking about a strip of grass so that we can reconstruct a sidewalk, for example, adjacent to someone's front yard. We also have a number of non-construction purchases, so shelters, pylons, buses, fare collection, as well as the major construction contracts. And on that last piece, the construction contracts, again, as it relates to DVE goals, the more recent ones have been in roughly the 15 to 16% range. On this slide, I did want to show an image of a standard arterial BRT station. One of the important ways that we're able to efficiently design, build, operate, and maintain these stations is to have a consistent design across the program and across the region. This is also a key part of making the system legible for our customers and consistent for people with different abilities who are using the service as well. And it's the starting point for how we enter that more detailed engineering phase of the project. I want to touch on a really important aspect of how we design and construct the projects, our partnerships with local agencies, our cities and counties. We have a couple of different ways that these typically show up in the corridor, in addition to engaging our city and county and agency staffs in decision development and recommendations along the course of the project. But typically, we do enter into fiber optic connectivity partnerships. This is building on a lot of the great work in our light rail program, partnering with Hennepin County to share that fiber optic network. And then we also have two main paths in which we coordinate overlapping construction projects so that we're minimizing impact, maximizing efficiencies, minimizing costs. One of the ways is Hennepin County or Minneapolis or another entity might construct the flat work for one of our stations if they've got a linear project in the same area. The other way that that goes is if there's a signal that wants to be rebuilt but doesn't need to be part of the project, that funding could come into the Metro Transit contract from one of our partners, and we would do that construction work on their behalf. So two main ways that we partner and a lot of partnership along this large network. This is an example of that, a locally funded crosswalk that Bloomington brought funding into the D-Line project to construct at American Boulevard and Chicago Avenue. With that, I'm going to take a breather and hand things over to Sophia for a minute.
I was just going to joke that I was going to give Katie a breather, but she already took that. So as Katie highlighted in kind of the benefits of these projects themselves, they are for enhancing our rider experience, getting people places faster, and are really done for the benefit of our communities. And so engaging with those communities is a critical part of the development of these processes, or these projects. They are 5 years from beginning to end, and so that gives us the opportunity to really do some really good engagement along the way. And so part of our approach to the ABRT program is to assign outreach coordinators to each project so they can dive into community and really work with folks through all stages. And I'll kind of illustrate that a little bit in next. So outreach and engagement isn't just like, woo, right? We make plans, we create material, we think strategically about how we hear things so that we can bring that back to project staff. We're integrated within the project team so that we hear the discussions that are happening from the technical staff so that we can bring that out to the community and engage with them in that. And so one of the first steps and things that we're able to do is develop ongoing working relationships with the neighbors that surround these projects, our riders, and the general community. And we do that intentionally, right? So whether that's stakeholder analysis, walking the corridor, reaching out and beginning to connect with mini groups, we start to get to know people, right? And it's not just send out an email and hope, right? It is intentional going out and doing. And some of that initial contact helps us with every stage that comes. as Katie showed in her slide, there's some very important decisions that happen early in the project. And so that's why this engage early and often is part of the approach to the ABRT program. When we're siting our stations, when we're making big decisions, we're putting together very, very robust plans and strategies to make sure that community is aware of those decisions that we are making and how they can influence them at the time that we're making them before they come to you for that ultimate decision. While we make plans and have things, we're also adjustable and flexible, in particular with the goal of reaching diverse communities and making it easy to give us feedback. And so an example of that, say on like a beeline, right, you might have an apartment building that you're engaging with and you know that you need to bring materials translated into Somali. But then you'll be working with the community organizers and they're like, hey, actually a lot of people prefer Oromo. So you'll go back and you'll create materials and then you'll go out specifically and ensure that everybody in that space can engage in their preferred way. And that's also both, going to places within community, but getting on buses, being at stations, hearing from our riders that use these services, right? Often these lines are some of our most used routes, and so we really want to develop them both with our community neighbors and with the people that are using our service and will benefit from the improvements associated with it. After we get these awesome projects together, we go out for construction, and we do a lot of work preparing communities for construction. And construction is always messy, right? So there's multiple phases in which we consider how we communicate construction details and timeline. And one of the fundamentals is that we project when we're going to start construction in all of our engagement, right? From the very beginning, when would construction be anticipated? As it gets closer, you start communications. In about a year, we're going to be breaking ground this spring. Our groundbreakings and other activities and the news associated with that is also part of that picture. And then we also dive into very specific details with people along the corridors. And so if we are going to dig in front of your door, we are knocking on your door. Multiple times, right? My outreach staff will come back from being in the field literally all day and be like, well, I knocked X amount of doors and so many people weren't there and I noted that, so I'm going back tomorrow, right? We are trying to reach people and have multiple strategies in which to find them, whether that's corridor mailings, flyering, actually going out, as well as our electronic and media communications that are associated with it. So really just our overall approach is taking a very planful and robust, easy to access step throughout the way. And to kind of showcase some of that, I have a few example activities. And that, whether that's attending a community event and literally putting sidewalk on just the street to help people visualize what a bus lane might look like and the changes how cool that will be when we put it in place. Having very detailed construction communications and maps so people can really understand what we're doing when and how. I have a famous story that I always like to tell in community, explaining that we're going to dig literally a 60-foot hole that's super wide, right? And then people are like, you're taking down the tree, right? So in our construction communications, we really emphasize what are the impacts associated with this. Both, here's this exciting thing that we're going to build, but this is the impact that you'll experience and when. And really doing a lot with that. Having our information accessible is also super important. So you see a flyer that got sent out, but we've used wide and far, soliciting feedback. It has multiple languages in it. It is plain language, and it also uses imagery to help people understand what they're engaging with. We hold events for people to come to us, but more importantly, we try to spend a lot of time going to people and spend a lot of time both with specific groups and partners and property owners. And sometimes that's a property owner that is a one person, right? And then sometimes that might be like the photo here where you have a bigger group of folks and you're engaging with a residential community. So overall, these projects are an investment Our engagement is part of that investment, and we really are very diligent in ensuring we hear from the community so that these projects can be the best that they can be.
All right, moving on. I want to speak a little bit to how we're beginning to implement this policy and managing risks within arterial BRT projects. So this is an ongoing process across project development. It's also a process that's still rolling out. And so I'll speak to where we're at right now. Again, highlighting the two major council actions that the council takes, and noting that unlike on other projects, there's not that same transition from a local project sponsor to the council in this process. So on ABRT, there are 3 layers of risk assessment and management that are in the process of being applied to these projects. The first is the application of the emerging enterprise risk practice, that spans all of the transitway projects and deals with both those risks that affect the project opening on time and on budget, but also those spanning operations. I'll note that we are planning to implement an upcoming arterial BRT program-wide risk assessment. This would be taking a look at those risks that span individual projects but maybe don't rise to that enterprise level, and also help us build the foundation for each project-specific risk assessment. I will note also that we do undertake project-specific risk registers and maintain those, focusing on those risks through the start of revenue operations on projects. This is a best practice that is currently being applied to the E-line as well as the F-line, where it is an FTA requirement because of that small starts funding. And we intend to apply that to all future projects regardless of the funding source. So on this slide, I'll take you through the top enterprise risks as they apply to the arterial BRT projects. And this is to a typical arterial BRT project. Again, these span both project development as well as the horizon out through operations. And these are risks that have been identified across all of the transitway projects in development, but the color coding here represents how staff have determined each of these risks applies to that typical arterial BRT project. So because the scale of ABRT projects is much smaller than the typical LRT or even Guideway BRT project, the assessed level of risk is proportionately lower in what we're presenting here. So I'll just walk through these at a higher level. Risks 1 through 3 deal essentially with having enough staff and financial resources to successfully operate these services. These are all ranked here very low to moderate, since arterial BRT generally replaces existing local bus service. But I will note that it does come with added maintenance needs as well as additional safety and security personnel needs. So that's why those two are ranked low and moderate. Risk number 4, the risk of not meeting regional performance thresholds for ridership is also very low on arterial BRT, owing to these lines being planned to replace and upgrade proven transit markets with significant local bus investment already. The 5th goal here deals with capital maintenance. And I'll note that BRT capital asset management is definitely a developing practice at Metro Transit as we're building out this network. However, given the relatively small scale of investments in these corridors, the risk that the enterprise will be unable to keep these assets in a state of good repair applies at that very low threshold, again, for a typical arterial BRT project. And the final risk deals with potential delays affecting the region's ability to meet regional goals. Here, too, the scale of these projects ultimately leads to that very low assessment on the risk register. As I mentioned, we're undertaking both the project-specific risk assessments as well as an upcoming ABRT program-wide effort. This slide summarizes within a typical project, again, the types of risks that rise to the top and are positioned to pose a risk to delivering the project on time and on budget. The first 3 deal with how we scope, plan, and design these efforts. One of the biggest risks or opportunities that we see on these projects, I've mentioned several times in this presentation, is how to align our schedules for delivery with our partners' plans for improvements in these same corridors. The opportunity to gain construction efficiencies and better design and fewer impacts is very real, and we are very closely aligned with our partners on many of these efforts. But the flip side of that is that if the two projects are linked together, risks that affect one ultimately affect the other. And so this is something that we are actively managing throughout the project, but most significantly during the planning era, to work with our partners to align our programmed priorities with their capital improvement programs, et cetera. And this has also influenced how we intend to bring corridors forward for the council to prioritize. Another aspect of our partnerships is the locally funded work that I mentioned, where partners can ask us to design and construct additional things in these corridors. The agreements and the navigation of identifying all of that work certainly is something that can pose a risk to the schedule and the budget of projects. And so that's something that we work closely with our partners to navigate and mitigate that risk. The third aspect here deals with stakeholder concerns around adjacent, localized impacts that could result in potential changes to project scope in order to address those impacts. This poses a risk to the project at various points in terms of delivering that on time and on budget, and is something that we continue to largely address through the robust engagement that takes place throughout these projects. I'll note here as well that in addition to the robust engagement being especially important at the beginning of the project, the council action to approve station locations is also a key risk mitigation measure in order to lock in those locations and allow for that detailed work to advance. Goals 4 and 5 on this slide are market factors that affect nearly every construction project that we or our partners take on. Supply chain and contractor availability affect pricing, schedule, and how we're able with these projects to meet diversity goals. And then finally, there's risk in each project that construction costs exceed the budget available and lead to delays. We mitigate this by using adequate project contingencies in our budgeting, as well as the ability to shift funds allocated to one project, one ABRT project, to another in the program. An example of this is how in the second quarter budget amendment, we are moving unspent contingency from the D-line project to the B-line. The flexible funding allows for that to take place. So with that, I have the remainder of the presentation focusing just a couple of slides each on the 5 active projects that the team is working on, with a little bit of a deeper dive into the B-line because it's under construction right now. So with regards to the B-line, this is an upgrade to Route 21, which is currently our highest ridership local bus route. It's in construction east of Hiawatha Avenue right now and in design, final design, west of Hiawatha. It's an estimated $65 million project cost. We've been underway on this effort for several years, and at this point, our planned opening is late 2024. And we're continuing to review that schedule as construction advances and as we work with our partners on the various intertwined efforts on these corridors. So as I noted, construction began this year. There are 30 platforms being constructed at 16 different intersections along this stretch of the B-line corridor. I'll walk you through some of the typical things that are happening right now. And if you haven't been out to see construction, there's a lot happening in this corridor. One item is that on Selby Avenue, we've got a narrow street where we need to do some subsurface work on storm and sewer utilities. And so in order to get that work done safely and quickly, we did allow our contractor to put in place 30-day full closures of Selby Avenue to make sure that could happen. That hard closure allows for crews to complete the work in this area several weeks faster than if we were to keep it open to traffic, but it does come with some more impacts, certainly. So prior to construction, as Sophia mentioned, outreach staff were pounding the pavement here and connecting with the homeowners, businesses, residents in the area, and making sure that folks had as much information as we had about construction activities occurring. I'll note that the next image I'm going to show includes a best practice that we implemented in response to some of the business owner feedback that we had received after construction started. So we deployed these enhanced signs the week of June 12th. Thank you, Councilmember Carter, for your work also in connecting the project team and community folks around this effort. I'll note that these signs now are going to be part of our toolbox whenever we have a full closure at an intersection to make sure that folks know what businesses are open in the corridor. So I will note that the intersections of Hamlin and Selby and Victoria and Selby were opened back up to traffic last week. The last one at Lexington is opening up at the end of this week. And we do have a couple of additional full closures planned to start in July where we will be deploying similar signage for the businesses there. Moving across the river, this is an image that shows that we've got a lot more going on Lake Street than just stations. The station here is shown as that yellow set of platforms, but through our partnership with Hennepin County and the City of Minneapolis, our construction contractor will also be making significant improvements at other intersections to upgrade ADA-compliant curb ramps and to replace traffic signals, as well as milling and overlaying the entire street, moving from a 4-lane undivided street to what's called a 3-lane street and allowing for the introduction of a westbound bus lane, which will significantly improve transit speed and reliability along this corridor. So as a result of all of that work happening, if you went down to Lake Street right now, you'd see something like this, where the essentially north curb of Lake Street is the construction zone, and traffic has been moved to the south side and moved into that 3-lane configuration. Within that north side lane closure, construction crews are out working at many intersections. We've got temporary signals up so that there's still safe and accessible crossings of Lake Street for pedestrians and for vehicles, business access as well. And that intersection work is progressing along the corridor. In phase 2, later this year, this traffic control will move to the south side of the street, and we'll be working there with the traffic shifted to the north. Stations are underway right now at 44th, at 36th, and down at 31st and Minnehaha. We'll start work this week. Even coming over here today, I noted that our crews have made significant progress from what this photo captured last week, with station foundations starting to take shape. As of this week, I'll note that just after 6 weeks of construction, our major civil work is complete at 10 platforms. So this is an example of one of those locations at Marshall and John Ireland. Our contractors are moving more rapidly than they did even on the D-Line project. And so we're making very strong progress. And while it's disruptive during construction, we are moving through things quickly, and so we can get things back open to the traveling public. After these stations are completed to this level, later this summer and into the fall, the shelters, the pylons will be set, all of the features will be installed, everything except for fare collection equipment. And these stations will start to be usable for customers on Route 21 today, well in advance of B-Line starting in late 2024. So that's the B-Line. Moving on then to the Metro E-Line. This is the upgrade of Route 6 from the U of M to Southdale. We're in design right now. We've been going through planning and engagement since 2019 on this corridor. Construction is planned to start in 2025, and right now we plan to open this line in construction starts in 2024, and we plan to open the line in late 2025. So the main focus of our work right now on the E-Line as we're moving through the design process is to publicly engage around the design advancement on that corridor. So the locations of stations were established at the corner, the intersection quadrant level in the 22 approved corridor plan that the council approved in 2022. Now we're focused much more heavily on sharing how we've advanced those stations through design and seeking additional feedback on details related to station placement, related to materials, related to sight lines, business visibility, things of that nature. Sophia's team has been leading the engagement activities that have been taking place, including a virtual open house, a lot of that pavement pounding that she mentioned, and door knocking, and a lot of discussions with corridor stakeholders, including many of whom have been engaged throughout the planning process and will continue to be engaged as we move into construction. So in terms of what that looks like, these are the types of things that we are designing right now, where we're at in the design process. This shows a preliminary design exhibit of the station at Hennepin and 36th with more detail than we had during the planning phase to say where shelters would be located, which sidewalk panels would get reconstructed, how the lane striping would work, using this to communicate those details to community members and station neighbors. And also, we are using exhibits like this. This is a rendering of a station at northbound 50th in France. And I bring this up particularly as an example of a place where we've heard a significant amount of feedback continue about the station design. We're working through that with our design team, and we'll be re-engaging with all of the folks that we've heard from with probably some changes to how this fits into the space. So this is a really key tool in how we're communicating about when these projects are at this stage in design, the continued engagement the community can have around the station design. Another key part of the Metro E-Line, each of these pink boxes on this map represents another project that we're coordinating construction and design with. I don't need to list them all. We've got many here, but the main effort to communicate is that each of these projects is being led by our partners. We're working closely with them to make sure that stations can be integrated in the design. And in many cases, we're also working on advancing Metro Transit's priorities for bus lanes in coordination with our city and county partners as they lead these street reconstruction projects. On to the F line. We are almost at the end of this alphabet so far. This is an upgrade to Route 10 running from downtown Minneapolis up to the Northtown Transit Center in Blaine. We are currently in planning. And this is a project, as I've mentioned, that is in the FTA Small Starts pipeline. It's currently in project development in terms of that process. We began planning and engagement on this corridor after the F-line was identified as a priority in 2021, and we plan to open this service in late 2026. And again, we'll continue to review that schedule as we work in particular with our partners at MnDOT in this corridor. So one of the actions that will be coming before the council later this summer will be to approve that F-line corridor plan to establish the station locations and conclude the planning process that's been ongoing for a couple of years at this point. So that would set the station intersections and the location of platforms within each intersection. And it represents a culmination of multiple months of very intensive community engagement around 2 thus far and a third upcoming versions of this plan, dating back to October when we released the draft plan for public comment. And then touching a little bit more on our important partnership with MnDOT on this key corridor, we've had significant coordination with a MnDOT-led study of trunk highways 47 and 65, or as we know them, University and Central Avenues, as they're looking at a broader vision of changes for this corridor, looking at ways to make the corridor safer, to address accessibility issues, and to make overall an investment vision that may look different from what that corridor looks like today. We have been working most recently to coordinate the design of F-line stations and roadway improvements in this next phase, even as MnDOT does not necessarily have a programmed project to build all of these improvements at the same time. So in the blue box, that represents where we are going to be entering into an agreement with MnDOT where they will provide funding for us to advance the preliminary design of the entire linear portion of that Trunk Highway 65 corridor. In the green portion, MnDOT's going to be taking the lead, advancing preliminary design in coordination with our F-line stations. We are committed to continuing to work very closely together as they're developing plans for this corridor. And as they continue to potentially identify funding for this corridor, we'll continue to coordinate around construction timing. All right, Metro G-Line, moving over to the East Metro, right out front here on Robert Street and Rice Street. This would upgrade portions of Route 62 and Route 68. We're also in planning on this corridor, and that planning work began just about a year ago. We plan to open this line in late 2027. The big story of coordination, in addition to beginning that very intensive effort of locating stations, is coordinating with our partners again. Ramsey County has quite a significant effort around Rice Street on the northern part of the corridor, highlighted in the pink here. We're working closely with the city of St. Paul as they plan to reconstruct Robert Street just outside here in 2025 and 2026. And then we're also working with MnDOT on this corridor. They have a project identified south of the river that they're currently undertaking scoping for. And one of the big questions is what that project will entail and how that will then align with the G-Line project, or how we might modify thinking about the G-Line project to best align with that effort. So we're really committed to that cooperative scoping effort with MnDOT and our partners across these projects. I did mention earlier in the presentation that with the $72 million of bonds awarded from the state this year, that G-Line project is fully funded. We're continuing to refine the budget and identify how all of those sources line up with all of the uses on the project, but we do consider that a fully funded project. We're also undertaking, in cooperation with our electric bus team, a fleet planning exercise and a review of a propulsion recommendation for this corridor. We know that there's a lot of interest in electric buses, and so we are moving this project through the process to apply the principles of the Zero Emission Bus Transition Plan to the fleet selection on the G-Line. We've been meeting internally and with our partners for several months on this process, on this corridor, and as I mentioned, corridor engagement has been ongoing since last year, both in coordination with these other projects, with Ramsey County, with the City of St. Paul, but also starting to talk with folks about the G-Line and the stations beyond those efforts. So this would come before the council as an information item later this year as we begin to bring that draft corridor plan out for public comment. Last and definitely not least, the Metro H line is the fifth project that we have in development right now. This is an upgrade and an extension of Route 3 from downtown Minneapolis out to St. Paul's east side. It represents a restructuring of the transit network from how that runs today, running into downtown St. Paul. We're in the early planning phase on this project, just beginning to wrap our arms around the number of issues, the stations, the stakeholders that will engage, and we plan to really start that effort later this year. We plan to open this project sometime in 2028, 2029. I'll note, just as we're early in the process, that one of the key distinguishing elements of this project, much like the B line, is that it connects to nearly every other line in the existing and planned metro network as that crosstown connection. It will significantly enhance access to jobs and to residents. And as I mentioned, we do plan to advance this line as our next priority in the upcoming regional solicitation. We're also working closely with the Metro Purple Line as they're undertaking the route modification study on Maryland Avenue. These two corridors could share an alignment, and so we're working closely with that project team to align those two efforts. That is the end of my presentation today, and I'd be happy, I know Sophia would be as well, to take any questions.
Riva.
Well, thank you. This was one of the most enjoyable presentations I've had this year, so this is great. I am very excited about all the planning of the BRT lines all the way through 2030, and it looks like this is also proving to be our first deep dive application into transitway advancement and transitway transitions. So it's good to see how that planning is being applied at the BRT level. I do have a couple questions, and that's regarding the enterprise risk, which was listed on page 22 and 23. There are levels of, well, there are mitigation, there's a mitigation column listed and mitigation needed, and the time periods indicated for each of the different categories. Are those mitigations going to be kind of broken down a little bit? And would there be different levels of mitigation? For example, a review might indicate that no mitigation is needed, or limited mitigation, or extensive mitigation. So my question is, is that going to be broken down further? And then I had another question on how do we measure risks against opportunities. I think it's really good to have this deep dive into the enterprise risks, but obviously we have to measure those against opportunities and for decision making. So I'd like to hear more about that.
I see Nick Thompson has arrived, so Nick.
Chair, committee members, those are great questions about our evolving process about enterprise risk. The ones we are presenting here today were built off some early work we did on Blue Line Extension this spring. Knowing we don't really have a process yet defined for the scale of how we're going to rate risks, how we're going to create risks. we clearly know we need each risk will have a mitigation plan. And the goal is that with a mitigation plan, it's to reduce a risk. So if we had a high risk, we'd have a mitigation plan and want to communicate to the council what we think that mitigation steps will do to reduce that risk. So it's still evolving. What we did for this, because we haven't developed the mitigation plans for each risk, is try to think through when we need to mitigate that risk by, what time frame, to give you a sense of which ones are more long-term in nature, like we need a plan in 20 years out, or show some of them that need to be mitigated in the short term. So that column maybe gives a initial clue about when that risk needs to be mitigated, but we do not have full mitigation plans developed yet, but we would for each risk.
Thank
Does that answer? Do you have any follow-up
Yeah,
on that? Go ahead, Deb.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just sort of to follow up, I think showing this is great, and I appreciate your comments because we were very clear that we were going to apply this to projects with partners and internally to us. I think that in risk management, you get to a point sometimes where maybe they've done everything they could do and a risk can't be completely mitigated, and that's really when it comes to us to say that risk is acceptable enough that the benefits outweigh the risks. And that's how I kind of envision it, but there's a lot of work that's done internally, and like we said, we're on month 8 of this, so we're still working on it. But so all these comments really kind of help. But that's at least in my mind when we were talking about this policy, how it would really be applied.
Yeah.
Those explanations were very, very helpful. And I was also, as I was thinking about the BRT, I was thinking about the Blue Line extension too. So I'm glad, Nick, that you mentioned that. And also that Councilmember Barber mentioned the cases where there may be some acceptable risks or inherent risks that might be occurring with a larger project or a longer-term project. So I think there'll be more to come on those mitigation development plans, so that's great. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, thanks. I know, Councilmember Cameron, you had your hand up, and then Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the entire ABR team. I know that I have asked a lot of your team as a new council member, and so I appreciate the amount of effort that you have put into working with stakeholders and working with myself and helping me better understand the ABRT system and the goals of that system. I had a couple of questions and then a request. So my first question relates to the identification of corridors and kind of, based on the timeline you presented, there was, some of these corridors have been in planning since 2012. And so with the Network Next process, is there an iterative process where you're going back and looking at originally identified corridors and making sure that this still makes sense as we move through? I mean, obviously we saw a lot of changes in ridership, but are we continually revisiting these corridors and making sure that as we are moving through each phase of the process that they still make sense?
Chair and council member, thank you for the question. I think one important aspect of each of these corridors is that the all-day, all-purpose, every kind of trip making that we see on these lines, that has remained sustained across the pandemic. And so as we've continued to see how travel patterns are changing, I think what we've seen is a lot of validation of investment in those corridors. And certainly as we think toward that next plan update in 2025, those will be some of the factors that we're looking at, both in terms of those candidate corridors that weren't prioritized but were looked at before, and then things that have continued to change. And in the meantime, I think we really continue to see this borne out by the ridership that we see on the BRT investments we've made to date and the types of trip making really being consistent.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have somewhat of an answer. So for our new council members, so Network Next was originally envisioned in 2019, 2020, and that was really going to be the overall service improvement plan, including all of our lines and including the ABRT system. Once the pandemic hit, we made a conscious decision to make Network Next only talk about and look at the ABRT system, and now you hear us talking about Network Now. That's the rest of because we have to recognize the differences. And so we're not working off of 2012 data when we have prioritized the series, at least of these lines through this point. But it was consciously kind of split out for that reason, and we wanted to make sure we updated it because we knew that things had changed, even in the maps that were drawn in 2012 to 2014.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really helpful to hear. I also wanted to ask about some of the community engagement efforts. And so when you're reaching out to communities, whether it's diverse communities or other stakeholders, you mentioned targeting languages, targeting maybe community organizers or advocates along routes. How do you go about identifying those groups, identifying targeted languages? Because, in the maps of some of the routes that you've shown, that can be really challenging. And I don't expect the community relations teams to be experts on every single intersection and every single corridor. And so how do you go about doing that work of identifying groups that would have impactful insights or are really embedded within those communities that we're proposing corridors within?
So one of the things, Chair.
Please.
One of the things that we do before we enter basically each stage of these projects is we put together a public engagement plan. And as part of those plans, we do kind of a stakeholder analysis, some of which is included in the plan, some of it which is just kind of noted in the deliverables of the plan. So you look at, there's multiple ways we do it. So it's looking at kind of just demographics of the area. So what can you glean from just kind of available data? And then you are doing kind of your various mapping activities. So where are your neighborhood groups? Can you identify the religious institutions? What can you see in terms of, just looking in the corridor of major organizations, as well as then all of your station neighbors, who are they, whatnot. And so that gives you kind of your initial basis of, okay, this is maybe our realm of folks that we need to know as we begin engagement. But then it's iterative. So one of the questions that the engagement team usually asks as we're out and about is, who else should we talk to? Or, as you're doing general kind of blast information, people are seeing it and responding to you. So as we begin engagement, we start to get deeper levels of detail about the community and ideas of how to engage. And so that's why plans are adaptable and iterative, because you're often we have, coordinators that already know an area, right? So they have the benefit of some of those initial contacts. But I know I've worked in areas where they're not my home base, and I'll go from kind of a preliminary idea of maybe who some of the main community organizers are or the big institutions, to basically closing my eyes and knowing both all the station neighbors to all the big organizations, even half mile off the corridor, and kind of the synergies that they have together. So you start out with what you can, and then by kind of these robust engagement strategies, you dive deeper. And it's also, as you're probably familiar, there's certain folks will get really engaged, right? So you also kind of get to know the folks that really want to come with you, that really want that information, really want to know what to anticipate. And you can also design your strategies around some of that. Or, an example is sometimes we'll have organizations that specifically serve somebody with a disability or refugees, and then you can think about how you do specific engagements to meet their needs. And one example of that is we'll bring out a bus, right? You'll actually do feel touch type activities. So hopefully that is answers your question, but it's the initial dive in, and then especially on projects like all the ABRT lines, you're engaging for a long enough time that you can really do that. And the last thing is that By the time they're getting to the stage where they're placing stations, you usually have a fairly robust idea of your stakeholders. And then by the time you get to constructions, you've had many touch points with the individuals.
Yeah.
Councilman Wilbur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will say, just having been watching these lines from A line all the way through where we are now, this team and Katie and her crew for sure have really changed how we do engagement on transit lines, because what they've done is really gone direct and be part of the community, be very present, be very accessible. I really think it's really the kind of the model for as we're doing some of our transit way work, because it's really kind of instead of sending a survey, they're out on the corners talking to people and showing them this is where a station will be. This is what we can help for the business. It's reacting to something like the businesses in the Selby neighborhood wanting a sign to point to them. It's been active, not static, and I think it's really changed what we do. So, yeah.
I'm really looking this way. I gotta make sure. Councilmember Carter, then Sue.
I just want to deliver applause for the work that you all do, and being a new council member, having called on you and observed the manner in which you respond quickly and actively and completely. I just have to say thank you so very, very much. That's not all. I know that and I should name, because I know him well now, Cody Olson, as a person who manages the responsibility of engaging with the community along the B-line, who has been just so very, very present. I've been in a couple of meetings with Cody, and I know that he is an example of the community engagement staff that you have. And I must say that he has been able to help work through a difficult circumstance with the closure along the B-line to a point where we feel as though we really have deepened partnership and relationship because of the response of the Metropolitan Council to that very difficult circumstance. We have opened up not only the ability to work through these issues, but because of your responsiveness, I think the hopes and dreams of the Avenue are alive. This becomes, yes, as you've said many, many times, these are our neighbors along that line. And this has become an opportunity for those neighbors to hear more, learn more, and envision more about the work that we can do together as stakeholder partners, whether we're talking about the city and the council person in that area, or about businesses and community organizations, associations, and councils along the line. It really has been a catalyzing opportunity. I say that because as we're in each neighborhood that we work in, I'm hopeful that we are catalyzing dreams and making connections to other partnerships and work that can happen, not just as we revitalize that avenue for transit, which we hope to celebrate together, but also as the neighbors come together around this transit project and begin to ask other questions. So I am asking whether we are prepared, from a community engagement standpoint, to connect to those resources actively, and also to be a center part of partnerships for the future. These are our neighbors along that avenue forever. And as we enhance transit and think about ways of enhancing the avenue and other areas around the station locations, I hope that we can be engaged with that community, not just because we've got this project over this 5 years, but maybe because this is a perfect catalyst for that engagement forever. I'm not asking a specific question, but could you respond a little bit to what we're finding the capacity to do?
Chair, Councilmember Carter, I'm very happy to respond to that question. And I'll take some fundamentals. One is, who do we hire in terms of our engagement staff? And there's a lot of skills that we look for, but ultimately when I'm sitting in an interview with people, I'm looking for folks that love community and act not as barriers to solutions, but as instigators. And I think I'm sure almost every council member in this room has a story of their favorite outreach coordinator that works in their district that delivers from them based on those values. And one of the ways that we can increase the expectations that the outreach coordinators deliver on is these shared experiences and practices that we carry across programs. So whether that is best practices that, as Councilmember Barber said, Katie's team often leads some of the best practices. So that's bringing that to other work that we're doing. Same with whatever staff is working on it, right? So that we can keep pushing the bounds of community engagement. And people often want to engage us in very holistic ways. So my staff act as the face and representatives often of our organization. And we've been very diligent, I think, in thinking right now about what time are we in and how do we ensure that the engagement team is staffed appropriately so that they're not just doing the basics, but able to invest time in real excellence. And that builds the reputation of our council. It inspires, right? Because we're doing transformational projects, right? That people can gather around. And so it is just like an engagement plan is a process and iterative, our engagement practice is a process and iterative that we can continue to expand and refine and redefine where our basis of excellence is. And so I feel very excited because I think we're at this pivot point where the team is doing amazing work that we can really reflect on. And we're at a point where we can continue to lean into those things and really bring them into the work that we do. And I hope to continue to work with all of you to implement that vision. And some of it is in just being responsive to the moment, but it's also having the capacity to do some of that follow-up work and that just relationship building. That's not like, hey, you're not complaining to me. I'm just stopping by to see how it's going. And that also helps so that when folks are reaching out to you with an issue, they have that basis of a relationship as well that we can expand upon and collaborate on. So that was kind of a robust-y, vision-y thing, but I feel like your statements responded to that, and we're working very diligently, I think, to staff appropriately to really meet those expectations. And so that, I think if you look at the arc of Metro Transit engagement, 5 years ago, you'd have been like, oh, wow. And then 5 years from then, we were doing even better and keep that going. And so I hope in the next 5 years, the practice that we have is even more stronger and robust than we have right now.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I really appreciate your response. And, the slogan, we instigate solutions, I like that too. But I wanted to say, in final comment, that I consider the work that you're doing, although it's with a project and it's technical in nature and responding to issues, I do consider it far more because of the transformative change that we're introducing that won't stop there, to be adapting to challenges as we see them and really bringing forward opportunities as well. So thank you so very much. I look forward to seeing that as it happens.
Councilmember Johnson, you had your hand up.
I did. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. I have a few questions. So first of all, I haven't had that opportunity yet in my district, but I have to thank Councilmember Lilligren, Councilmember Chambliss, who came to an exciting Highway 55 potential project meeting someday, all the way from Minneapolis out to Medina. And there is so much enthusiasm and excitement and stakeholders from the state and local and certainly regional level in that. So thanks for that. I can't wait to go through this type of project. I hope I'm around long enough to see that happen. So that's very, really cool. Just quickly, on transit transition policy, that's different from the advancement policy? I just was curious about the naming. just briefly.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, that was an error on my part. I apologize.
Okay, and I just wanted to make sure, because I thought, well, maybe BRT has a bit of a difference to it, but okay, thank you for that clarification, because that helps me stay consistent in my thought process. As far as on slide 22, I just have a couple quick questions there. Again, this is kind of looking at all of the projects, and you've kind of done an overview of all the projects, kind of generally. Each will have their own. Am I understanding that correctly?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember, there'll be an overall enterprise risk, I think, that from the council level, and then there'll be individual project risks for each project too. So I think there'll be enterprise risks that are universal across projects, but they'll be rated differently possibly by project.
Okay, thank you, because again, we're looking at this and I appreciate, I love the color coding and makes it easy to understand, but I would also it was curious, like, especially on items 2 and 3, and just the criteria that we're using to assign that risk, because having been on the transit policy work group, and certainly coming through COVID, and just the workforce changes, and having some projects certainly in the past that have been difficult in logistics and all of that, I don't need to know the criteria tonight, but I'm surprised they aren't just a little bit higher of a concern, but that doesn't need to be addressed either, because I know you have a good handle on it. I just need to understand at some point, how you are evaluating based on criteria, because this is great, but to know how you got there is important to me as a policymaker. I also, and again, just on the capital risk, it goes back to, and I really appreciate this policy, because as we know, some of these long plans have people change over time in our partner organizations, and mindsets change over time. So that's why this is really great, and especially with the capital investment programs that we have, just making sure that, at whatever mark, vehicles need to be changed out. And, even we know with light rail, even though this is about BRT, the rust mitigation situation that happened. And with that, I would say it's really important too that I know Councilmember Barber stated, and I would agree, that at some point though, a risk mitigation will come to the council, because we'll have to make a decision. For me, it's just, especially going on year 5, the sooner we can get it at the right moment, you got to work through it on your end and with community and partners, but I don't like getting things at the 11th hour where we're backed into a corner, and that's not good policy making from my point of view, and I'm sure for all of you as well. So the sooner we can really understand where those risks are coming. I had a couple hard votes as a council member, because I did not understand how long staff had known about a risk. But this will help us get there, and I know 99% of the time we don't have to make those decisions, because you're doing a great job. The other thing I would like to say too is when it comes to engagement, and this comes from when we were doing some of our listening sessions with the police department, and I'm really excited about the direction our new chief is taking things, and I think building community in that as well. But we are certainly engaging public safety and police into this work as well. Would that be correct? I didn't hear that today, but I just know that is a big piece of change. People become fearful. We're in the news a lot, rightly or wrongly. It's not just a Metro Transit issue. So just so that police officers, I know in the listening sessions for those of us who attended, had some really good ideas, even about station planning and some of the things that they encounter in the hows and wheres and all of that. So hopefully we've integrated with them too, and they're an important part of the planning process. And then maybe last but not least is, I really appreciated seeing the sign on the Selby Avenue closure. I've been working in economic development roles in my lifetime, pretty much as in my adult career, and certainly at the city council level. A sign is great, but a sign because they've asked for it is kind of a, not, if we can get proactive with those businesses and help them, whether it's some social media or signage or communications to all of the stakeholders in the neighborhood that they're open, that is really important to the businesses, because they've got their life on the line here, all in. And it doesn't take much to disrupt a small business and put them into jeopardy. And then I would say too, it would be nice to know if there's some way of doing a business impact survey with data that we can gather before how, I will tell you, businesses aren't always readily interested in sharing sales data with us, but if we can generally find out how are you doing now, especially coming through COVID, they might still be in a rocky position. And then if we could do some sort of business impact survey afterwards, and they might not still, maybe business is great and we figured it out with them, but I know that in some corridors, maybe even way back to the Green Line, and maybe even as we're talking about Blue Line extension, there have been talks about helping, in one way or another where it's financial, which I don't think are baked into these plans, but some way to help figure out some business support other than some of the things that, certainly signage and we're still open and that kind of a thing, but really getting ahead of that because we talk a lot about the neighbors. That is super important. I know people not even in my district that have reached out to me and they're fearful of the thing coming in front of them because it will disrupt their entire lives, right? But the businesses are a big deal too. So I think that is important. And I want to agree. I think this is one of the best presentations I've seen. It was very well done, super comprehensive. It helps to understand what the global goals here are as we try to address the whole region. And again, I can't wait for the day that one starts potentially out in my neck of the woods. So congrats on the great work you're doing.
Councilmember Vento, you next, followed by Pacheco.
This isn't transit related. I just wanted to make sure that it was officially noted that 3 weeks ago last night, the city of Golden Valley had the good wisdom to appoint Sophie to fill a vacancy left by a council member who had to step away. And I just wanted to, along with my colleagues, congratulate you, Sophie.
Yes. Wow, she'll become one of my stakeholders that I get to engage with. This is super exciting.
I read an article about it, and it talked about how they interviewed 5 candidates and that you wowed them. And we're not surprised.
And we're not at all surprised. Congratulations.
Congrats.
Thank you.
All right, Joe.
Just real quickly on page 37, I'm looking at the E line, and I'm not getting into this today, but if I look at it right now, the which normally was a Xerxes bus, the number 6, does that go away?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Pacheco, good question. A different version of this map shows the planned service that we have as a concept plan right now. I'll say that our service development team generally puts together an early plan for what would happen with bus service in the corridor while we're taking forward that corridor plan, but then closer to implementation while we're in construction, they'll go through the final process, more community engagement around that, and bring forward that final plan. So right now in that concept plan, we've identified that Route 6 would continue to run along that Xerxes branch and provide that service coverage where the E line is picking up the France Avenue branch of the Route 6 today.
So that's what, like maybe 8 blocks, I think it is, so you move over to France, maybe a little bit more, but.
I believe it's a mile between the two. I could be wrong.
So I guess just bottom line, will there be a 6 then down Xerxes?
The current plan is that there will be a Route 6 service on Xerxes.
Because I get questions, and I don't know when you put this out there, because right now we're doing the community, and I've got my neighbors talking to me about it. Maybe even a sentence or some things to make sure that they're not losing their whole route there.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's been an important point to emphasize as we've been talking with community about this, is what is that local service change? And it's different in each corridor, and in this one, given those 2 branches of the 6, that's a really important message to keep carrying forward.
Well, thank you.
Go ahead, Councilwoman.
On that note, I think what would be helpful is really revisiting. I think a couple of council members have mentioned just the impacted businesses, people's livelihoods are at stake, and so if we're being really proactive with updates, not just as we're moving through different phases of the project, but as we're continually providing feedback to stakeholders about what is happening. I know that a month can feel like a really short amount of time, but if it's your livelihood that's at stake, it feels like a very, very long time. And so if we're repeatedly going back to stakeholders and putting out updates, just that we're continuing, public comment period or whatever it is, as we're moving through different phases of the project. I think that would help alleviate some of the concerns because it adds a note of transparency in where we are at in the project and that there's not anything, they haven't missed out on any updates. And I think that is part of the concern that we're hearing is that there's just not a level of communication that allows for that transparency and trust between stakeholders.
Deb.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and then I'll be done talking, so we're getting close to 6, so just some final comments. I just want to say thank you for all of this, and I know it's probably very interesting for current or original and new or existing, or we're now all new council members or whatever we're calling it, but it was good information, but I just want to say, like, of all the things over the years that I've worked on, obviously I do a lot of work with transportation and transit here at council, that I am so proud of this program and what we're doing with it. And when you look at the D-line, within 3 months, it had over 1 million rides. Not only are these things that connect to community, these lines really provide a great service to people who are transit riders now and people who weren't transit riders before. It's really, really, really kind of the star of our transit system. So just appreciate it very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for saying that. Any other comments, thoughts, questions? Well, Katie, Sophia, Nick, thank you so much. Clearly, you can tell we're excited about this system, and it is the future, and it's happening right now. So,
Good job.
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
That is our council meeting today. I want to just make one. I could make a couple of comments, but first off, since Leslie and Brian are in the room, I spent some quality time with them this last weekend. I have to say, quite amazing how Metro Transit, the light rail systems, the operators, everyone stepped up, and quite amazing to watch trains load at US Bank Stadium at 11:30 at night when there's a sea of people and 600 people at a time, and then here comes another train right behind them. And I would say it was at 45 minutes, probably almost 6,000 people, when you think about 10 train sets coming through. So for all the anxiety and worry, we did a remarkable job. And I've quoted Patrick Tanis with the governor's office before, but he came to me last night and he said, I heard it was better than the concert. So I said, well, maybe not. Not quite that good, but it was a great show. And frankly, the whole Pride weekend as well. And many of you have heard, probably in the news, the legislative auditor hearing was, I guess, I would say charitably rough. But I also still am very confident in our project team on the Green Line extension. And, it's kind of easy to criticize in hindsight, but I've tried to represent the council to say that we have, in humility, have made mistakes, and certainly that corridor and not having it budgeted at the level it needed to be is certainly something we have to face. But we're doing the right thing in the settlement agreement and rebaselining the schedule, and I think we have to stand tall and own that, because that's very important, that we have done the right thing. We continue to learn, and some of what we've heard here even today as we look at risks going forward, the transit advancement policies, pretty important. So is how we do the project governance. Forget Met Council governance. Project governance itself and how we work with our partners is really important that we get those things right at the beginning, not when it's too late. But anyway, I just really am proud of our partners and our project team and others who have kind of stayed resolute in the face of criticism to do the right thing. So.
Mr. Chair, I want to thank you and everybody else that, through session and through, all the interviews, trying to really, put forward the history that goes back, decades. And I appreciated your comments. I listened on the way in to your NPR interview. And, not everything is perfect, but we are learning. And I do agree with you that had we all been back 20-some years ago as this was starting, and we were starting to think, how are we going to budget and what the railroads were going to require, and all of the things on the route that ended up, we would know that we were short from the start. But we have to deal with what we have. It's going to be a nice project when it's done, and we are taking those learnings. So appreciate your leadership, because I know that's not easy to be in the hot seat.
Not my first choice. Thank you, Chief. Any other comments, questions, thoughts today? No? No? Well, I'm going, our regional administrator, Marie, do you have any comments from the Office of Administration? It's nice seeing you here.
Mr. Chair, it's been an honor to fill in tonight, but there's no report.
No report. Our Chief Counsel, Ann.
No report.
No reports. All right, well, we have an extra 10 minutes. Enjoy the afternoon and the day. Wow, we have a lot going on. Isn't this an exciting place to be, the Met Council? This meeting is adjourned.